She was not supposed to be there. That was the thing nobody could explain afterward, not the partners at the law firm, not the building security, not even Zuri herself when she replayed that afternoon over and over in her mind during the long sleepless nights that followed. Her daughter Amara had simply wandered. 7 years old, curious as sunlight, quiet as a shadow, she had slipped away from the firm's waiting area where Zuri had told her to sit and stay, and she had walked down a corridor she had no business walking down, pushed open a door that should have been locked, and ended up standing in a room that would change both their lives forever. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Every story has a beginning, and this one begins not with a whisper or a gunshot, but with a woman who simply wanted peace. Zuri Dlamini had not come to Seoul looking for love. She had not come looking for danger or adventure or anything remotely complicated. She had come because Seoul was far. Far from Johannesburg, where she had grown up watching her mother press her school uniform at 5 in the morning with hands that never stopped moving. Far from Cape Town, where she had passed her bar exam on the first attempt and cried in the bathroom of the examination center because her father had not lived long enough to see it. Far from New York, where she had built what she thought was a life, a career, a marriage, an apartment on the 14th floor with a view of the Hudson River that she had loved more than she probably should have. Far from the mediation room where her marriage had been quietly, politely dismantled by 2 attorneys who charged by the hour and felt nothing. She had come to Seoul because a prestigious Korean law firm called Shin & Associates had offered her a secondment position to assist with a major international merger, and because the salary had made her close her laptop and sit very still for several minutes, and because her best friend Naledi had grabbed her by both shoulders and said, "Zuri, you are 41 years old and you are still magnificent and you need to go somewhere the past cannot find you and remind yourself of that fact." So she went. She arrived in Seoul on a Thursday in March when the cherry blossoms were just beginning to appear along the Han River like small pink promises. Amara had pressed her face against the airplane window as they descended and whispered, "Oh mama, look at the lights," and Zuri had leaned over and looked and thought, yes, this is the right decision, this is exactly what we needed. Their apartment was in Yongsan-gu, clean and modern with heated floors that Amara declared was the best invention in human history, and a view of Namsan Tower glowing at night like something from a dream. It was nothing like the brownstone in Brooklyn that Zuri had loved. But it was theirs. Fully, quietly, uncomplicatedly theirs. And that was worth more than she could say. If you are watching this right now and you have ever had to fold up an old life and carry it somewhere new and try to unfold it again without losing any of the pieces, then you already know exactly who Zuri Dlamini was in those first weeks in Seoul. She was not broken. She was not looking for rescue. She was a woman in the careful, deliberate process of reconstructing herself, and she was doing it with the same precision and discipline she brought to every contract she had ever reviewed, every clause she had negotiated, every argument she had made before a room full of people who had underestimated her and lived to regret it. Shin & Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower in Gangnam, the kind of building that made you straighten your posture just walking through the lobby. Zuri's role was to work alongside the senior partners on the cross-border acquisition of a technology company with operations in both South Korea and the United States, a deal that involved enough zeros to make even seasoned attorneys speak in hushed tones. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. There was something about the architecture of a complex legal document that satisfied her the way a perfectly solved equation satisfies a mathematician. Everything in its place, every contingency accounted for, every possible vulnerability identified and protected against. Her Korean colleagues had been polite but cautious in those first days, the way people are when they are not quite sure what to make of someone who arrives already fully formed. Zuri had not minded. She had spent her entire career being the only one in the room who looked like her, and she had long ago stopped waiting for rooms to decide how to receive her. She simply walked in, opened her briefcase, and got to work. By the end of the second week, the junior associates were coming to her with questions they were too afraid to ask the senior partners. By the end of the third week, senior partner Shin Hyun-woo had told her privately that her analysis of the indemnification clauses had saved the firm from a liability exposure they had not even seen coming. Zuri had nodded, thanked him, and gone back to her desk. She did not need the validation. But she appreciated the honesty. The challenge, as always, was Amara. Not that Amara was difficult, she was the opposite of difficult. She was the kind of child who made adults stop and look twice, not because she demanded attention but because she had a quality of stillness about her that was unusual for her age, a sense that she was always listening to something just slightly beyond what everyone else could hear. The challenge was simply logistics. Amara attended the Seoul International School in Mapo, which had excellent reviews and a warm community of expat families, but the school day ended at 2:30 in the afternoon and Zuri's work rarely released her before 7. On most days, a kind older Korean woman named Mrs. O who lived 2 floors below them would collect Amara, feed her, help her with her homework, and deliver her back to Zuri's door with a container of whatever she had cooked for dinner. Zuri paid her well and brought her South African honey bush tea from the small African grocery she had discovered near Itaewon, and Mrs. O received both with equal delight. But on Tuesdays, Mrs. O visited her sister in Suwon. And on Tuesdays, Zuri had no choice but to bring Amara to the office. It was a Tuesday in late April when everything changed. Zuri had set Amara up in the firm's small reception area on the 32nd floor with her tablet, a pair of headphones, a juice box, and a very clear set of instructions. Stay in this chair. Do not wander. Do not talk to strangers. If you need the bathroom, tell the receptionist whose name is Miss Yoon and she will take you. Amara had looked up from her tablet with those enormous serious eyes and said I understand mama in the tone of a child who genuinely did understand and also found it slightly unnecessary to be told something so obvious. Zuri had kissed her forehead and gone into the conference room where 3 hours of document review awaited her. What happened next, Zuri would piece together later from security footage, from Miss Yoon's tearful account, and from Amara herself, who described it with the calm precision of someone narrating a documentary. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, a delegation arrived on the 32nd floor unannounced. 6 men in dark suits moving with the particular coordinated efficiency of people who were paid not just to accompany someone but to protect them. And in the center of this formation, unhurried and utterly self-contained, was a man whose name Zuri would learn only later. Kang Jiwoo. He was not what most people imagined when they heard the words Korean Mafia boss. He did not look like a villain from a movie. He looked like a man who had been through something that had burned away everything unnecessary and left only what was essential. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that carried the kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself because every room it enters already knows. He was 53 years old. He had built an empire across Seoul that operated through legitimate businesses on the surface and something considerably less legitimate underneath. Everyone in certain circles knew this. Nobody said it out loud. Miss Yoon, flustered by the sudden arrival, had stepped away from her desk to alert senior partner Shin. It had taken her perhaps 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, Amara had looked up from her tablet, noticed the commotion, and being Amara, being exactly and entirely Amara, had slipped off her chair and followed her curiosity down the corridor. She had pushed open the door to the small conference room at the end of the hall. The one that was supposed to be locked. The one where one of Kang Jiwoo's men had temporarily left a nervous, sweating man who was speaking rapidly into a phone. Amara stood in the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds before a guard noticed her and gently but firmly closed the door. 30 seconds. That was all. But Amara had heard a name. And she had seen a face. And she had stored both with the perfect innocent accuracy that children possess before the world teaches them to filter and forget. She went back to her chair. She put her headphones back on. She said nothing to anyone. It was not until 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, that Zuri was scrolling through the news on her phone and a headline appeared about the unsolved murder of Kang Min-jae, 19 years old, only son of prominent Seoul businessman Kang Jiwoo, a case that had gone cold despite enormous pressure on the police to solve it. There was a photograph of the young man. Bright eyes. Easy smile. A boy who had looked like he had his whole life arranged neatly in front of him. Amara looked over her mother's shoulder at the screen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pointed at the photograph and said in a voice as calm and certain as rainfall, "Mama. I know who killed that boy." Zuri turned slowly and looked at her daughter. Amara looked back with those eyes that had always seemed to carry more than they should. And the world, which had been so carefully, so deliberately rebuilt into something quiet and manageable and safe, cracked open again without warning. Zuri set down her phone. She turned fully to face her daughter, pulling her close, keeping her voice even despite the cold that had begun spreading through her chest. She said, "Tell me. Tell me exactly what you saw and what you heard." And Amara, who never exaggerated and never invented and never told a story that was not true, told her. Every word. Every detail. The man's face. The name he had spoken. The 3 words that had followed it. All of it delivered in the steady unhurried voice of a 7-year-old who did not yet fully understand what she was carrying but understood completely that it was important. Zuri listened without interrupting. When Amara finished, Zuri held her for a long time without speaking. Outside their window, Seoul moved through its Saturday morning, vendors setting up, couples walking, the city indifferent and enormous and completely unaware that in a quiet apartment in Yongsan-gu, a South African-American lawyer was sitting very still with her daughter in her arms, understanding with absolute clarity that the life she had so carefully rebuilt was about to be tested in ways she had not prepared for. She had 2 choices. She could say nothing and protect her daughter by staying invisible. Or she could do what every instinct in her trained legal mind was telling her was the right thing. She sat with those 2 choices for the rest of that Saturday and all of Sunday. She barely slept. She reviewed them the way she reviewed a contract, looking for weaknesses, for consequences, for the clause that would undo everything if she chose wrong. By Monday morning she had made her decision. But before she could act on it, Seoul had already begun moving toward her. She did not have to find Kang Jiwoo. Kang Jiwoo found her first. It happened on Monday afternoon, 48 hours after Amara's quiet revelation on the couch. Zuri was at her desk on the 32nd floor of Shin and Associates, working through a stack of due diligence documents with the focused intensity she applied to everything, when senior partner Shin Hyun-woo appeared at her office door with an expression she had not seen on his face before. He was a composed man by nature, the kind of person who delivered difficult news the way a surgeon makes an incision, cleanly, without hesitation, without visible emotion. But standing in her doorway that Monday afternoon, he looked like a man who had received information he was not entirely sure how to carry. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He said, "Attorney Dlamini, I need to speak with you about something sensitive. There is a client who has requested a private meeting. He has specifically asked for you by name." Zuri looked up from her documents. She said, "Which client?" Shin Hyun-woo said the name quietly, the way people say the names of things they have a healthy respect for. Kang Jiwoo. The cold that had started in her chest on Saturday morning returned immediately. She kept her face completely still. Years of sitting across negotiating tables from people who wanted to rattle her had given her a face that could receive almost anything without flinching. She used it now. She said, "When?" Shin said, "Tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. He has requested that the meeting be private. Only you." Zuri nodded slowly. She said she would be there. Shin looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, as if he wanted to say something else, as if there was a warning somewhere behind his composed expression that professional courtesy was preventing him from delivering. Then he nodded back and left. Zuri sat very still for exactly 60 seconds after he closed the door. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her documents, because there was nothing else to do, and because falling apart had never once solved a single problem in her life. That evening she called Naledi in New York. It was early morning there and Naledi answered on the second ring the way she always did, already fully awake, already fully present, which was one of the things Zuri loved most about her. Zuri did not tell her everything. She told her enough. She said there is a situation developing here and I need you to know that if anything happens to me, Amara goes to my sister in Cape Town immediately and the details are in the blue folder in my email drafts. Naledi was quiet for a moment and then she said, Zuri Dlamini, what exactly have you gotten yourself into? And Zuri said, I am not sure yet but I will know by tomorrow morning. Naledi said, do you need me to come? And Zuri said, no. Not yet. Naledi said, you call me the moment that meeting is over. Zuri said, I will. They stayed on the phone for a few more minutes without saying much and then they said goodnight the way old friends do, carrying the weight of everything that had not been said between the words. She did not tell Amara anything. She bathed her, fed her, sat with her while she read her book, answered her questions about whether penguins could live in Seoul if they really wanted to, tucked her in, and kissed her forehead twice. Then she went and sat on the balcony in the dark with her rooibos tea and the city spread out below her and thought through every possible version of what tomorrow morning could bring. The meeting was held in a private room on the 34th floor, 2 floors above Zuri's office, in a space that the firm reserved for its most significant clients. It was a beautiful room, floor-to-ceiling windows, a long table of dark polished wood, chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Zuri arrived 7 minutes early because she always arrived early to every room she needed to own. She arranged her notepad, uncapped her pen, and was reviewing a single sheet of notes she had prepared when the door opened at exactly 9 o'clock. Kang Jiwoo walked in alone. No guards. No entourage. Just the man himself, which told her immediately that this was not a performance. This was a conversation he wanted to have without witnesses on either side. She had seen photographs of him in the news articles she had quietly researched over the weekend. The photographs had not prepared her for the reality of him. He was the kind of man whose presence reorganized the atmosphere of a room simply by entering it, not through aggression or noise but through a quality of absolute stillness that paradoxically made everything around him seem to move slightly faster. He was dressed simply. Dark jacket, white shirt, no tie. He sat down across from her without being invited to, which she noted, and looked at her with eyes that were dark and direct and gave nothing away for free. He said, in English that was precise and slightly formal, Attorney Dlamini. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. She said, of course. How can I assist you, Mr. Kang? He said, I want to talk to you about your daughter. The room temperature did not change. The city continued its indifferent Monday morning outside the windows. Zuri's hand, resting on the table beside her notepad, did not move. Her face did not move. But something inside her chest tightened with a ferocity that she had not felt since the night she had stood in the doorway of a hospital room and been told that her father was not going to make it. She said, calmly, my daughter is 7 years old and has no business with you. He said, I know. I also know that she was on this floor 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday afternoon. I know that she opened a door she was not meant to open. I know that she saw a man who was in that room. And I believe she heard something. Zuri said nothing. She held his gaze and said absolutely nothing, which was its own kind of answer and also its own kind of armor. He leaned forward very slightly. He said, I am not here to threaten you. I want you to understand that clearly before this conversation goes any further. I am not here to intimidate you or your child. I am here because my son was murdered 8 months ago and the people responsible for it are still walking the streets of this city, and I have been told by someone I trust that what your daughter saw and heard in that room may be the closest thing to the truth that I have found in 8 months of looking. Zuri studied him. She had sat across from liars her entire career. She had developed an instinct for the particular quality of stillness that genuine grief produces in a person, the way it settles into the body differently from anger or fear, the way it makes a person's eyes go very quiet in a way that cannot be performed. She looked at Kang Jiwoo's eyes and she saw that stillness. She said, how did you know my daughter was there that day? He said, the security footage was reviewed after a separate incident in the building. Your daughter appeared in one of the recordings for approximately 30 seconds outside the room in question. I had my people identify everyone who was in this building that afternoon. Your daughter was the only one whose presence was accidental. Zuri said, and the man in that room. Kang Jiwoo's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough to tell her everything she needed to know about how much this cost him to discuss with a stranger. He said, his name is Park Seo-joon. He was my son's closest friend. And I believe he knows exactly who gave the order to have Min Jae killed, because I believe he was in the room when it was discussed. The silence that followed that sentence was long and full. Zuri picked up her pen. Not to write anything. Just to have something in her hand. She said, Mr. Kang, even if my daughter heard something, she is a child. Whatever she may have retained from 30 seconds in a doorway would not be admissible in any court in this country or any other. You know that. He said, I am not looking for a court, Attorney Dlamini. I have tried the courts. The courts have been managed. I am looking for a name. One name. That is all I need to know in order to understand what happened to my son. After that, what I do with that name is my own concern. She looked at him steadily. She said, what you do with that name is precisely what concerns me, Mr. Kang. I am a lawyer. I have a daughter. I am not in the business of feeding information to men who operate outside the law regardless of how justified their reasons may be. He said, I understand that. I expected you to say exactly that. Which is why I want to make you a different kind of offer. She said, I am listening. He said, your secondment here ends in 4 months. After that you return to New York. In the meantime you and your daughter are living in this city essentially without protection, without connections, and without any understanding of how dangerous certain corners of Seoul can become for people who accidentally know too much. I am not saying this as a threat. I am saying it as a fact. The man your daughter saw in that room, Park Seo-joon, is not a careful man. He is a frightened man. And frightened men do dangerous things when they suspect they may have been seen. Zuri was quiet. He continued. He said, what I am offering you is this. For as long as you remain in Seoul, you and your daughter will be safe. Completely and absolutely safe. Not because I am placing guards on your door, which would be conspicuous and unnecessary, but because my name in this city functions as a kind of insurance that most people are not willing to challenge. In exchange, I am asking only for a conversation. With you present at all times. A conversation with your daughter, conducted gently and on her terms, in which I ask her only what she remembers. Nothing more. Zuri said, and if what she remembers is nothing useful. He said, then we part ways and you never hear from me again. She looked at him for a long time. The city shimmered behind him through the floor-to-ceiling glass. She thought about Naledi saying you need to go somewhere the past cannot find you. She thought about Amara saying Mama I know who killed that boy in that voice of absolute undecorated certainty. She thought about the blue folder in her email drafts and the sister in Cape Town and the 2 choices she had been sitting with since Saturday and how neither of them had ever felt entirely clean. She said, I will need 48 hours. He said, of course. She said, and I want something in writing. Not a legal document. Just something that confirms the terms of this conversation in your own words. Signed. Something shifted in his expression then. It was not quite surprise. It was closer to recognition, the particular look of a person who has encountered someone operating at the same level of seriousness as themselves and has registered it. He said, that is a reasonable request. She said, I know it is. I am a lawyer. For the first time since he had walked into the room, something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile exactly. But it was adjacent to one. He said, 48 hours, Attorney Dlamini. She said, 48 hours, Mr. Kang. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left the room with the same unhurried self-containment with which he had entered it. Zuri sat for a moment after the door closed. Then she exhaled very slowly, uncapped her pen properly this time, and wrote one sentence in the center of her notepad. He is telling the truth. She stared at it for a moment. Then she underlined it once and closed the notepad and went back downstairs to finish her work, because that was what she did, and because the documents were still waiting, and because falling apart had never once in her life solved a single problem. That evening she sat Amara down after dinner at the kitchen table with the heated floors humming quietly beneath them and the Namsan Tower glowing through the window, and she said, "Baby, I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth exactly the way you always do." Amara put down her fork and looked at her mother with those eyes and said, "Okay, Mama." Zuri said, "That day at my office, the Tuesday 3 weeks ago, when you wandered down the corridor. The door you opened. The man you saw inside. Do you remember what you heard him say on the phone?" Amara was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone trying to remember, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of what they already fully remember to release at once. Then she said, "Yes, Mama, I remember. He said a name and then he said I already took care of it. And the name he said was Director Wu." Zuri stared at her daughter. Amara picked her fork back up and said, "Can I have more rice, please?" And somewhere across the city in a penthouse in Gangnam, Kang Jiwoo sat alone in the dark with a glass of whiskey he had not touched, staring at a photograph of his son, waiting for 48 hours to pass. 48 hours pass the way difficult hours always do, slowly during the day and all at once in the middle of the night when there is nothing to distract you from the weight of what you are carrying. Zuri slept in fragments. She would drift off and then surface again at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, lying in the dark of her Yongsan-gu apartment listening to the distant sound of the city and running calculations in her mind the way she ran them through every complex case. What is the risk? What is the exposure? What is the cost of action versus the cost of inaction? And who bears the consequence if I get this wrong? The name Amara had given her, Director Wu, had sent her directly to her laptop the moment Amara had gone to bed that Tuesday evening. She had searched carefully, methodically, the way she researched everything. What she found had made her sit back in her chair and stare at the ceiling for a long time. Wu Changsik, Director of Corporate Affairs at a major Seoul conglomerate called Daesong Group, one of the largest privately held companies in South Korea. 61 years old. Impeccable public record. Charity work. Government advisory panels. The kind of man whose photograph appeared regularly in the business pages alongside words like distinguished and respected and visionary. The kind of man who had spent decades building a reputation so solid and so carefully maintained that it functioned as its own protection, because nobody looks for rot in a foundation that gleaming. But Zuri was a lawyer. She knew better than most that the more immaculate a surface, the more deliberate the effort to keep it that way. She dug deeper. She pulled public filings, cross-referenced corporate structures, traced subsidiary relationships until 3 in the morning when her eyes were burning and her tea had gone cold. And what she found, buried under 4 layers of holding companies and nominee directorships, was a business relationship between Daesong Group and a logistics company that Kang Jiwoo's organization was publicly known to have had disputes with 18 months ago. A dispute that had apparently been resolved quietly, off the record, around the same time that Kang Min-jae had begun, according to the news articles, working more closely with his father's legitimate business interests. She could not prove anything. She was a corporate lawyer, not a criminal investigator, and what she had found was circumstantial at best and speculative at worst. But she had spent 20 years learning to read the shape of a thing before she could see the whole of it. And the shape of this thing was deeply, deeply troubling. She called Kang Jiwoo's number. He had left it with senior partner Shin, on Wednesday evening, 1 hour before the 48 hours elapsed. She did not wait for him to speak first. She said, "I have made my decision. We will meet. But my conditions have not changed. I am present for the entire conversation. It happens on neutral ground of my choosing. And my daughter does not repeat anything she tells you to anyone else. Not your associates, not your lawyers, not anyone. Whatever she shares stays between the 3 of us." He said, "Agreed." She said, "Friday evening. There is a restaurant in Itaewon called Sora. Private dining room in the back. 7 o'clock. He said, I will be there. She said, alone. A pause. Then he said, alone. She said, good night Mr. Kang. And she ended the call before he could say anything else, because she needed him to understand from the very beginning that she was not a woman who could be managed or maneuvered or made to feel like the smaller person in any room, including ones he was accustomed to controlling entirely. She had not yet told Amara who they were meeting. She had simply told her on Thursday evening that they were going to have dinner on Friday with a man who wanted to ask her a question, that the man was sad because something bad had happened to someone he loved, and that Amara did not have to say anything she did not want to say. Amara had listened to all of this with her customary seriousness and then said, is it the man from the news, Mama? The one whose son died? Zuri had looked at her daughter and thought not for the first time that raising this child was one of the most humbling experiences of her life. She said yes baby. That is who it is. Amara had nodded once and said okay and gone back to her book. Friday arrived gray and cool, a light rain moving through Seoul from the west and softening the edges of everything. Zuri dressed carefully, not to impress but to armor. A deep burgundy wrap dress that she had bought in Cape Town the year before she left for New York, a dress that her mother had told her made her look like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. Low heels. Her hair natural and full. She helped Amara into a navy dress with small white flowers that Amara had chosen herself and declared was her serious dress, which Zuri found both charming and entirely appropriate for the occasion. They arrived at Sora at 6:50. The restaurant was warm and smelled of doenjang jjigae and sesame and something sweet from the kitchen. The owner, a small energetic woman named Madame Jung who had somehow become one of Zuri's favorite people in Seoul over the course of 3 visits, led them to the private room at the back without being asked, because Zuri had called ahead and arranged everything. The room was simple and comfortable, a round table, soft lighting, a small window overlooking a narrow rain-wet alley. Amara immediately climbed into a chair and began examining the menu with the focus of a professional. Kang Jiwoo arrived at 7 o'clock exactly. He was alone, as agreed. He wore dark trousers and a charcoal gray shirt and he looked, if anything, slightly less armored than he had in the conference room on Monday, which Zuri suspected was deliberate and which she appreciated as a gesture even while she did not allow it to lower her own guard. He stopped when he saw Amara. Something happened in his face that he did not try to control, a softening that was entirely involuntary, and Zuri filed that away because it told her something important about who this man was underneath the empire and the reputation and the carefully maintained stillness. Amara looked up from her menu and studied him with the frank unself-conscious assessment that only young children can get away with. Then she said, "You look sad." "Are you sad?" Kang Jiwoo pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He said, "Yes. I have been sad for a while." Amara nodded as if this was a reasonable and sufficient answer. She said, "My mama was sad when we left New York. But Seoul made her less sad. Maybe Seoul will help you too." Something moved through his expression again, not quite the almost smile from Monday but something deeper and less controlled than that, something that lived closer to the part of a person that grief has cracked open and left raw. He said, "Perhaps it will." Zuri watched this exchange and said nothing. She had learned long ago that there are moments when the most powerful thing a person can do is be completely quiet. They ordered food. Madame Jung brought japchae and galbi and a small bowl of mayak guk that she declared was good for the soul without being asked for her opinion, and nobody contradicted her because she was almost certainly right. Amara ate with the focused enthusiasm she brought to all good food. The conversation stayed light for the first 20 minutes. Amara told Kang Jiwoo about her school, about her best friend Suah who had taught her to say 3 things in Korean, about the fact that she believed the Han River was probably home to at least one very large and very polite fish who minded its own business. Kang Jiwoo listened to all of this with an attention that Zuri recognized as genuine. He was not performing interest. He was actually interested. And she understood, watching him, that this was perhaps the first ordinary human conversation he had sat inside for 8 months, and that it was doing something to him that he had not anticipated. When the plates were cleared and Madame Jung had brought barley tea and a small plate of teok that Amara immediately began investigating, Kang Jiwoo looked at Zuri. She gave him a slight nod. He turned to Amara. He said, "May I ask you something?" Amara said, "Yes." He said, "A few weeks ago, at your mama's office building, you opened a door by accident and saw a man inside who was talking on the phone. Do you remember that?" Amara said, "Yes." He was sweating. And he looked scared. Grown-ups don't usually look scared like that. Kang Jiwoo said, "Do you remember what he said on the phone?" Amara said yes without hesitation. She said he said Director Wu, and then he said I already took care of it, and then he said he won't be a problem anymore. And then the big man closed the door. The room was very quiet. The rain tapped gently against the small window. Somewhere in the restaurant beyond the closed door, someone laughed at something and the sound floated through briefly and then was gone. Kang Jiwoo sat very still. His hands were flat on the table. His face had gone through several things in the space of those few seconds, a tightening, a stillness, something that looked briefly and terrifyingly like the edge of grief breaking through the surface before he pulled it back down with what was clearly a practiced and exhausting effort. He said, "And the man's face. If you saw a photograph, do you think you would recognize him?" Amara said, "Yes. He had a scar here." She touched the left side of her own jaw, just below the ear. Small. Like a little crescent moon. Zuri watched Kang Jiwoo's hands on the table. The left one pressed down slightly harder. Just for a moment. Then it released. He said, very quietly, "Thank you." And then he said it again in Korean, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, and Zuri did not need a translation because some things carry their meaning entirely in the sound. Amara looked at him with those eyes. She said, "Did that help you?" He said, "Yes. More than you know." Amara picked up a piece of teok and offered it to him across the table. She said, "Then you should have some of this because Madame Jung said it is good for the soul, and I think right now your soul needs it." Kang Jiwoo looked at the small piece of rice cake extended toward him by this 7-year-old South African American child in her serious navy dress with the white flowers, and for just a moment, in the soft light of that private dining room in Itaewon while the Seoul rain moved quietly outside, something behind his eyes gave way in the way of a man who has been holding something enormous for so long that a single small and unexpected gesture of kindness is enough to reach the part of him he has been guarding most carefully. He took the teok. He said thank you in a voice that was slightly different from all the other voices he had used that evening. Softer. Less constructed. Zuri looked down at her barley tea. She allowed him the privacy of the moment. And she noticed, with the part of herself that was always observing even when she wished it would rest, that something had shifted in the room. Something that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with the fact that grief, when it is real, has a way of making the walls between people temporarily thinner. She was not ready to examine what that meant. She filed it away and picked up her tea and looked out the small window at the rain, and Seoul continued its Friday evening all around them, indifferent and enormous, completely unaware. After dinner, as they stood outside under the restaurant's small overhang waiting for their car, Kang Jiwoo turned to Zuri and said, "The man your daughter described. Park Seo-jun. The scar confirms it. He was my son's closest friend. He was also, I have since learned, on the payroll of Woo Chang-sik for the past 2 years. I did not know this when my son was alive. Min-jae did not know it either." Zuri said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I am going to find out the truth. All of it." She said, "And then?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "And then I am going to make sure that what happened to my son cannot be buried the way powerful men in this city have been burying inconvenient truths for decades." She studied him. She said, "That sounds like something a lawyer could help with." Through legitimate channels. He looked at her for a long moment. The rain fell softly around them. Amara was standing between them holding both their hands without having asked permission to do so, which was exactly the kind of thing Amara did, and neither of them had pulled away. He said, "Are you offering, Attorney Dlamini?" She said, "I am considering it. Give me the weekend." He said, "I seem to always be giving you time." She said, "That is because I use it well." That almost smile again. Slightly more than almost this time. Their car arrived. Zuri lifted Amara inside and buckled her in and straightened up and found Kang Jiwoo still standing there in the rain without an umbrella, which struck her as either deeply symbolic or simply practical, and she could not decide which. She said, "Good night, Mr. Kang." He said, "Good night, Attorney Dlamini." And then, after a pause, he said, "Thank you for trusting me enough to come." She said, "I did not trust you. I assessed you. There is a difference." He said, "Yes. I am beginning to understand that." She got into the car. As it pulled away from the curb, she looked straight ahead and did not look back, because looking back was a habit she had spent 2 years in Seoul trying to break. But she was aware, with a precision she could not entirely account for, of exactly where he was standing and exactly how long he stayed there before the rain and the distance swallowed him from view. Beside her, Amara had already fallen asleep against the window, her serious navy dress with the white flowers rising and falling gently with her breathing, one small hand still loosely curled as if she had only just let something go. Zuri drove through the Friday night city and thought about legitimate channels and inconvenient truths and the particular quality of a man's voice when grief has made it briefly, unexpectedly honest. And she thought about what it meant that in the middle of all of this, the danger and the calculation and the 48-hour deadlines and the careful measured decisions, the thing she could not stop returning to was the look on Kang Jiwoo's face when a 7-year-old girl had offered him a piece of rice cake across a dinner table. She thought about it all the way home. She was still thinking about it when she carried Amara inside and put her to bed and stood in the doorway of her daughter's room for a long moment in the dark. Then she went and made herself a cup of tea and sat on the balcony with the city below her and began, very carefully, to think about what legitimate channels might look like when the man at the center of the case was both the most dangerous person she had ever sat across from and, she was increasingly certain, the most honest. It was going to be a long weekend. The weekend was long, as she had known it would be. Zuri spent Saturday at her desk by the window while Amara drew elaborate maps of imaginary kingdoms on the living room floor, spreading paper and colored pencils across the heated tiles with the serious organizational energy of a small urban planner. Zuri had her laptop open and 3 legal pads beside it and a cup of rooibos that went cold twice before she remembered to drink it, and she worked through everything she had found during her late-night research sessions the way she worked through every complex matter, methodically, without rushing, building the architecture of it piece by piece until the shape of the whole became clear. What she was looking at, she understood by Saturday afternoon, was not simply a murder. It was a cover-up that had been engineered with considerable sophistication by people who understood exactly how institutions worked and exactly which pressure points to apply to keep inconvenient things from rising to the surface. Woo Chang-sik had not simply ordered the death of a young man. He had spent the months following it constructing a version of events so clean and so well placed within official channels that it had effectively neutralized every investigative effort Kang Jiwoo's considerable resources had mounted. 2 detectives had been quietly reassigned. A witness had recanted. A piece of surveillance footage from a camera near the location where Min Jae had died had been logged as corrupted in the police database. Zuri knew corrupted evidence. She had spent years in corporate law watching powerful entities make inconvenient information disappear, and she recognized the fingerprints of institutional manipulation the way a musician recognizes a chord even when it is played out of tune. What Woo Chang-sik had done was thorough. But thoroughness, she had learned, always leaves edges. The very effort required to smooth everything over creates its own pattern, and patterns, if you know what you are looking for, are readable. She found the edge on Saturday evening just before 7 o'clock, when Amara had abandoned her maps in favor of watching a nature documentary about elephants, and the apartment was filled with the sound of a narrator describing the extraordinary memory of a matriarch who never forgot a face or a path or a loss. Zuri found it in a corporate filing from 14 months ago, a transfer of shares in a subsidiary of Daesong Group to a holding entity registered in Singapore, timed to the exact week that the police investigation into Minji's death had been officially deprioritized. The amounts were not remarkable. The timing was. Shares do not move like that in the middle of a police investigation unless someone is settling a debt, and debts of that kind have only one currency in the world Wu Changsik inhabited. She sat back and looked at what she had found and understood that it was not evidence in the courtroom sense. Not yet. But it was a thread. And she had learned over 20 years that if you pull the right thread with enough patience and enough precision, the whole constructed surface eventually comes apart. She called Kang Jiwoo on Sunday morning. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been waiting even though she suspected he would never admit it. She said, "I have found something. I want to discuss it with you, but I want to do it correctly, which means I need to understand what your objective is before we go any further. Not the emotional objective. The practical one. What outcome are you actually trying to achieve?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want the truth on record. Officially. Publicly. I want the people who did this to my son to be accountable in a way that cannot be quietly managed or reassigned or made to disappear. I want it done in a way that cannot be undone." She said, "That is a legal objective." He said, "I know. That is why I came to a lawyer." She said, "You came to me because my daughter was in a doorway at the wrong moment." He said, "I came to you because your daughter was in a doorway at the wrong moment, and because when I sat across from you in that conference room you looked at me like someone who was completely unafraid of what I am, and in my experience people who are unafraid of what I am are either very foolish or very capable. You are clearly not foolish." Zuri looked out at the Sunday morning Seoul skyline and said nothing for a moment because she was human enough to acknowledge privately that this was one of the more striking things anyone had said to her in recent memory, and professional enough not to let that acknowledgement show in her voice. She said, "I want to be clear about what I can and cannot do. I am a corporate lawyer on secondment. I do not practice criminal law in South Korea. What I can do is help you build a civil and regulatory case, document what I have found, connect it to the appropriate authorities through proper channels, structure it in a way that makes it very difficult for institutional pressure to neutralize it the way it was neutralized before. That means going outside the Seoul police. It means international regulatory bodies. It means using the cross-border nature of Daesong Group's operations as the mechanism. It will be slow. It will be meticulous. And it will require you to be patient in a way that I suspect does not come naturally to you." He said, "I have been patient for 8 months. She said, "You have been frustrated for 8 months. That is different from the kind of patience I am describing." A pause. Then he said, "You are very direct." She said, "I am a lawyer. Direct is the only speed I operate at." He said, "When can we start?" She said, "Monday. My office. 8 o'clock before the rest of the firm arrives. And Mr. Kang, from this point forward, if you engage me in this matter, you do exactly what I advise. No parallel actions. No separate approaches through your own channels. Whatever you have been doing on your side of this investigation stops while we work through the legitimate process. Those are my terms." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who has operated by his own rules for so long that being asked to operate by someone else's requires a genuine internal renegotiation. She waited it out without filling it, because she had learned that silence, correctly deployed, was one of the most powerful tools in any negotiation. He said, "Agreed." She said, "Good. 8 o'clock Monday." And she ended the call. Monday morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of Seoul morning that smells like possibility and makes the city look like it has been cleaned overnight and set out fresh. Zuri dropped Amara at school 40 minutes early, exchanged a brief word with the gate attendant who knew them by now and gave Amara a small tangerine from the bag he kept on his desk, and then drove to Gangnam and was at her desk by 7:15, which gave her 45 minutes to organize her notes before Kang Jiwoo arrived. He arrived at 7:58. He was alone again. He wore a dark coat over a dark suit and he carried nothing, no briefcase, no phone visible, nothing in his hands, which she found interesting. A man who walks into a meeting carrying nothing is either very confident or very accustomed to having everything he needs provided for him. In his case she suspected it was both. She had arranged 2 chairs at the small table beside the window rather than sitting across the full desk from him, because this was not an adversarial meeting and she wanted the physical arrangement of the room to reflect that. He noticed this. She could tell by the way he took his seat, not the careful, assessing way a person sits when they are trying to understand what is being communicated, but the slightly more settled way of someone who has understood it and registered it as significant. She opened her first legal pad and said, "I am going to walk you through what I have found. I need you to listen without reacting until I am finished. Can you do that?" He said, "Yes." She talked for 40 minutes. She laid out everything, the share transfer, the timing, the pattern of institutional interference, the cross-border regulatory exposure created by Daesung Group's Singapore structures, and the specific legal mechanisms she believed could be used to bring the matter before bodies whose authority was not subject to the kind of domestic pressure that had derailed the original investigation. She spoke the way she always spoke in these situations, precisely, without embellishment, naming each piece and its significance and its limitation with equal honesty, because she had never in her career believed that a client was best served by being told only what was comfortable. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Kang Jiwoo was looking at the legal pad in front of her, at the neat columns of notes she had made, at the architecture of the thing she had built from 3 days of careful work. His face was doing something complicated. She waited. He said, "You built all of this in a weekend." She said, "I had good material to work with." He said, "How long will the full process take?" She said, "If everything goes correctly, 6 to 9 months. Possibly longer. The Singapore angle will require coordination with authorities there. The cross-border filings are complex. And we will need to be extremely careful about how we move because the moment Wu Changsik's people sense that a new approach is being mounted, they will start managing the exposure from their end and we cannot give them time to do that." He said, 6 to 9 months. She said, "Justice through legitimate channels does not move on the schedule of the people who want it most. It moves on the schedule of the process. That is its strength and its frustration in equal measure." He looked at her. He said, "And you are willing to do this? Even knowing what it involves? Even knowing who I am and what my involvement in this city's less legitimate operations might mean for your professional standing if this becomes public?" She said, "I have thought about that." He said, "And?" She said, "My father used to say that the law is only as strong as the people who are willing to use it when it is inconvenient. He was a magistrate in Johannesburg for 30 years and he said it mostly to himself, I think, on the hard days. But I remembered it. I have always remembered it. And what happened to your son was wrong. The covering up of it was wrong. And I am a lawyer in possession of information and capability that could address that wrongness through the correct process. So yes. I am willing." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, Gangnam was fully awake now, the morning traffic building, the city in full operational mode, indifferent as always to the particular weight of the conversations happening inside its towers. Then he said, "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man." She said, "He was. He died before I graduated law school. He did not see me pass the bar." He said, "I am sorry." She said, "So am I. Every day." The honesty of that surprised her slightly. She did not usually offer that kind of thing in professional contexts. But there was something about the way this man sat with grief, not performing it, not managing it, just carrying it visibly in the way of someone who has stopped pretending it is not there, that had a disarming quality she had not fully accounted for. She cleared her throat and looked back at her legal pad. She said, "I will need access to whatever documentation you have gathered on your own over the past 8 months. Everything. I will go through it and identify what is usable within the legal framework and what needs to be set aside." He said, "I will have it sent to you by this afternoon." She said, "Sent securely. Not email." He said, "Of course." She said, "And Mr. Kang. The agreement we discussed. The written one. I will need that before we proceed any further." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a single folded sheet of paper and placed it on the table between them. She picked it up and read it. It was brief. 7 sentences. In his own handwriting, which was precise and slightly angular, the handwriting of someone who learned to write with great care and never lost the habit. It confirmed the terms of their arrangement exactly as discussed, signed at the bottom with a signature that was nothing like the elaborate constructions most powerful men used and everything like the man himself, simple, direct, undecorated. She folded it and placed it in her briefcase. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Thank you, Attorney Dlamini." And he said it with a weight that told her he was not thanking her for the formality of the document but for something larger and less definable, for the weekend of work, for the Monday morning meeting, for the fact that she had looked at what he was and what he needed and had chosen, carefully and with full knowledge of the cost, to help anyway. She said, "We should meet again Thursday to review the documentation. Same time." He stood and buttoned his coat. He said, "Thursday." And then, at the door, he paused. He said, "How is Amara?" She said, "She asked me this morning whether the sad man from dinner was feeling better." Something moved through his face. He said, "What did you tell her?" Zuri said, "I told her I thought he was working on it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That is accurate." And he left. Zuri sat alone in her office in the early Monday morning quiet and looked at the legal pad full of notes and the briefcase containing a 7-sentence handwritten agreement from the most powerful man in Seoul's underworld, and she thought about her father pressing his magistrate's robe in the kitchen at 6 in the morning while she watched from the doorway in her school uniform, and she thought about the law being only as strong as the people willing to use it when it is inconvenient, and she picked up her pen and wrote at the top of a fresh page, in the clean deliberate handwriting of a woman who had always known exactly where she was going, the words, "Case Strategy, Phase 1. And she began. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Zuri had experienced only a handful of times in her career, the quality of a case that has found its momentum and is moving with the kind of steady unstoppable energy that comes from being built correctly from the foundation up. She worked early mornings and late evenings, arriving at the office before the cleaners had finished and leaving after the last associate had gone home, building the regulatory filing with the same architectural precision she brought to every complex matter, layer by careful layer, each piece interlocking with the next in a way that left no gaps for institutional pressure to find purchase. Kang Jiwoo's documentation had arrived on Monday afternoon as promised, delivered by a quiet man in a plain jacket who handed Zuri a sealed case at the reception desk and left without giving his name. She had taken it home that evening and gone through it at the kitchen table after Amara was in bed, and what she found inside had kept her awake until nearly 3 in the morning, not from distress but from the focused electric concentration of a lawyer who has just found the missing piece that makes the entire structure of a case suddenly, irrefutably clear. He had been thorough. 8 months of private investigation, conducted through channels she deliberately chose not to examine too closely, had produced a body of material that was raw and unprocessed and in many places obtained through means that no court would ever touch. But embedded within it, like clean water running through complicated ground, were several pieces of information that were entirely legitimate, photographs taken in public spaces, financial records that were matters of public filing, witness accounts from people who had not been reached by Wu Changsik's management effort because they existed at the edges of the situation rather than its center. People who had seen small things and not understood their significance until someone asked the right questions. She spent the next 3 weeks doing what she did best. She took the raw material of 8 months of grief-driven investigation and she translated it into the precise, formally structured language of a regulatory complaint that could be filed simultaneously with the Korean Financial Services Commission and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, targeting the cross-border share transfers that she had identified as the financial signature of the cover-up. She drafted carefully, choosing every word the way a surgeon chooses an instrument, for precision, for purpose, for the minimum necessary intervention that would produce the maximum correct result. Thursday meetings with Kang Jiwoo became the rhythm of those weeks. 8 o'clock, her office, before the rest of the firm arrived. He was always precisely on time, always alone, always carrying nothing. She had begun to understand that this was not simply a habit but a kind of philosophy, that a man who has spent decades surrounded by people whose loyalty was contingent on his power develops a particular appreciation for rooms where the only currency is the quality of the thinking being done inside them. They talked about the case. Mostly about the case. But the way they talked about it shifted gradually over those weeks in a way that Zuri noticed but did not immediately name. He began asking questions that went beyond the purely strategic, not just what are we filing and when but why does this mechanism work better than that one, how does cross-border regulatory authority actually function in practice, what makes certain evidence legally durable when other evidence that feels more significant is not. He was not asking to manage her or to second-guess her. He was asking because he was, she discovered, genuinely and seriously intelligent in a way that his public profile had entirely obscured, the way a deep river can look shallow when you are only seeing the surface. She answered his questions directly and without condescension, the way she answered every question from every client who was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply trying to control. And she found, to her own slight surprise, that she enjoyed explaining things to him, not because he required explanation but because the quality of his attention made the explaining feel like a genuine exchange rather than a lecture. On the fourth Thursday, he arrived with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the ground floor of the building, which he set on the table between them without comment or ceremony, as if this were something they had always done. She had looked at the cup for a moment and then picked it up and said nothing and he had said nothing and they had opened the case file and gotten to work, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room in a way that both of them were aware of and neither of them addressed directly, because they were both people who understood the value of not naming a thing before you are certain you understand it. Amara, who understood things with a directness that circumvented all the careful architecture adults build around their feelings, had asked one evening at dinner whether the sad man was their friend now. Zuri had said they were working together on something important. Amara had considered this and said that was basically the same thing, and Zuri had looked at her daughter and thought that 7 years old was, in many respects, the most epistemologically honest age a person ever got to be. The filing was ready on a Thursday morning in late May, 6 weeks after Zuri had first sat across from Kang Jiwoo in the conference room on the 34th floor. She had printed it, 214 pages including annexures, and it sat in a bound document on the table between them while she walked him through the executive summary. She explained what they were alleging, what evidence supported each allegation, which regulatory bodies were being engaged and why, and what the realistic range of outcomes looked like across a spectrum from best case to most conservative. When she finished he was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the document rather than at her, at the cover page with its formal headings and its precise language, and she understood that he was not reading it but receiving it, receiving the fact of it, the reality that 8 months of a grief that had felt entirely without traction had been transformed, by 6 weeks of work, into something that existed in the world as a formal, structured, legally durable object that could not simply be made to disappear. He said, quietly, "My son would have been 20 years old next week." The room was very still. Outside the window the May morning was bright and clear, the kind of Seoul spring day that is almost offensively beautiful when you are sitting inside with something heavy. Zuri did not fill the silence with anything. She let it exist at its full size, because grief deserves the space it actually occupies and not the compressed version that social convention tries to assign it. After a moment he said, he wanted to study architecture. He used to draw buildings when he was small. On any piece of paper he could find. On napkins in restaurants. On the margins of his school notebooks. I used to tell him to pay attention in class. I used to take the pencil out of his hand. Zuri looked at him. She said, he knew you loved him. He said, I am not sure that I showed it correctly. She said, no parent is sure of that. That uncertainty is part of what love costs. He looked at her then. Not the assessing, contained look he brought to most things, but something less defended, something that lived in the part of him that the grief had cracked open and that 6 weeks of Thursday mornings had perhaps widened slightly further. He said, you are remarkably good at this. She said, at law. He said, at being honest with people in a way that does not make them feel diminished by the honesty. She looked back at him for a moment. Then she said, my father taught me that. He said the truth is the only gift you can give someone that costs you something real to give. Everything else is just transaction. He said, your father was right. She said, he usually was. It was profoundly inconvenient when I was a teenager. Something genuine broke through his face at that, not the almost smile of the earlier weeks but an actual, unguarded, fully inhabited smile that changed the entire character of his face and made him look, for just a moment, like the person he might have been before the years and the empire and the loss had built up their careful layers over whatever was original in him. It lasted only a few seconds. But it was real and she saw it completely. She looked back down at the filing. She said, we submit today. I have arranged for simultaneous filing in both jurisdictions at noon. After that, events will move at their own pace and there will be periods of waiting that will require the patience we discussed. He said, I remember. She said, the waiting is the hardest part. I want you to be prepared for that. He said, I have been waiting for 8 months, Attorney Dlamini. She said, yes. But before you were waiting with nothing. Now you will be waiting with something in motion. That is a different experience. It can feel slower, paradoxically, because now there is something specific to wait for. He nodded slowly. He said, and in the meantime. She said, in the meantime you live your life. You run your businesses. You take no action outside this process. And you trust that what we have built is strong enough to hold. He said, do you trust that it is? She said, I built it. So yes. He looked at her steadily. He said, then I trust it too. The filing went in at noon exactly. Zuri submitted both packages simultaneously from her office, received the automated confirmation receipts, saved them in triplicate in 3 separate secure locations, and then sat back in her chair and exhaled the long slow breath of a person who has just completed something that required everything they had and has arrived at the far side of it still standing. She texted Naledi one word. Done. Naledi replied in under 30 seconds with 7 exclamation points and a string of emojis that Zuri found excessive and deeply comforting in equal measure. That evening she took Amara to the small park near their apartment, the one 3 minutes away that had been one of the first things she had loved about the neighborhood. It was a warm May evening and the park was full of the particular Friday evening energy of a city releasing itself from the week, couples, families, elderly people on the benches watching everything with the serene authority of people who have lived long enough to know that most things resolve themselves if you give them sufficient time. Amara ran ahead on the path and then doubled back and took Zuri's hand and they walked in the easy comfortable silence of 2 people who have lived closely enough together that they do not need to fill every moment with sound. Amara said, Mama, are you happy today? Zuri considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said, I think I am something close to happy. Something that is on the way to happy. Amara said, is it because of the sad man? Zuri looked at her daughter. She said, partly. Amara said, I think he likes you, Mama. Zuri said, we are colleagues, baby. We are working on something important together. Amara said, Mrs. O says that the best love stories start with people working on something important together. She says that is how her husband found her. She was fixing a bicycle and he stopped to help and they got married 6 months later. Zuri said, Amara. Amara said, I am just reporting information, mama. What you do with it is up to you. Zuri looked at her 7-year-old daughter standing in the evening light of a Seoul park with her serious face and her enormous eyes and thought that raising this child was genuinely one of the most humbling and hilarious experiences of her life and also the truest thing she had ever done. She squeezed Amara's hand. She said, "Come on. Let us go get bingsu." Amara said excellent, and they walked toward the little dessert place at the park entrance, and the Seoul evening folded around them warmly and completely. And somewhere across the city in a penthouse in Gangnam, a man who had carried 8 months of grief like a stone in his chest sat by his window and looked at the skyline and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not quite lightness but was perhaps the first movement toward it, the particular sensation of a weight that has been shared beginning, slowly and carefully, to shift. And if you are watching this right now, wherever in the world you are sitting, whether you are in Atlanta or London or Toronto or Lagos or Seoul itself, and you have ever carried something heavy alone for so long that you forgot what it felt like to put it down, then you know exactly what Kang Jiwoo felt sitting by that window. And you know that the most unexpected thing about relief is not the relief itself but the person who, without being asked and without being required to, chose to help you carry it. Like this video if this story is speaking to something in your heart right now. And drop a comment below, tell us where in the world you are watching from today. We love hearing from our Afro-Korean love tales family spread across the globe. Now let us see how this story ends. The regulatory process moved the way Zuri had told him it would, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the steady inexorable momentum of a correctly built legal mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do. The Korean Financial Services Commission acknowledged receipt of the filing within 72 hours. The Monetary Authority of Singapore followed 4 days later. Neither acknowledgement said much beyond the formal confirmation that the matter had been received and assigned, but Zuri read both letters with the practiced eye of someone who understood that the language of institutional acknowledgement, however dry, carries information in its structure that is invisible to the untrained reader. The assignments were to senior investigators in both jurisdictions. That mattered. It meant the filing had not been routed to a junior desk to gather dust. Someone with authority had looked at what she had built and decided it warranted serious attention. She told Kang Jiwoo this on the following Thursday morning over the coffee that had by now become an unspoken fixture of their meetings, as natural and unremarked upon as the legal pads and the files and the precise 8 o'clock start. He received the information with the contained stillness she had come to recognize as his version of relief, not an exhale or a visible relaxation but a quality of quiet that was slightly different from his usual quiet, slightly less armored, like a room where someone has opened a window by 1 inch and the air has changed in a way you feel before you consciously notice it. The weeks that followed were the waiting weeks, as she had predicted. The investigators worked. The filing sat in the machinery of 2 regulatory systems and did what filings do, generated correspondence, requests for additional documentation, internal reviews, the slow grinding movement of institutional process that feels from the outside like nothing is happening and from the inside like everything is happening simultaneously and none of it is visible. Zuri responded to every request within 24 hours. She maintained 2 dedicated case files, one for each jurisdiction, updated daily. She slept better than she had in months, which surprised her until she understood that the specific anxiety of carrying a decision, of not yet having acted, had been replaced by the different and considerably more manageable anxiety of waiting for an action already correctly taken to produce its result. She and Kang Jiwoo continued to meet on Thursdays. Technically these meetings were for case updates. In practice, as the weeks passed and the updates became briefer because the process was moving at its own pace and there was simply less to report, the meetings became something else as well, conversations that ranged further, that touched the edges of things neither of them had expected to discuss with the other. He told her about building his first legitimate business at 26, a trading company in Busan that had started with 3 employees and a second-hand truck. She told him about her first year as a qualified lawyer in Cape Town, working 18-hour days in a small firm that handled mostly property disputes, sleeping on a fold-out cot in the office twice a week because the commute was too long to justify going home. He told her that he had always regretted not learning to read music despite having played piano as a child, that his teacher had told him he played beautifully by ear but that playing by ear was a ceiling and learning to read was a door, and he had been too impatient at 12 years old to understand the difference. She told him that she had started learning Korean in the evenings, slowly and without any particular deadline, just because she had decided that living in a place whose language she could not speak felt like moving into a house and never opening half the rooms. He had offered, quietly and without making it into anything larger than it was, to help her practice. She had said yes with the same unceremoniousness, and so Thursday mornings had acquired a new and slightly improbable coda, 10 minutes at the end of the case update in which Kang Jiwoo, who spoke Korean with the particular authority of someone for whom it was the language of both power and private grief, taught Zuri Dlamini phrases that went beyond the translation app on her phone. She was a quick learner. He was a patient teacher. Neither of them remarked on the strangeness of this, which was itself a kind of intimacy, the ability to do an unexpected thing together without requiring it to be explained or justified. Amara, when informed that Mr. Kang was teaching her mother Korean, had looked up from her homework and said "I knew it" and gone back to her work with the satisfied air of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed by the data. The break in the case came on a Wednesday morning in late June, 11 weeks after the filing, in the form of a phone call from a senior investigator at the Korean Financial Services Commission named Inspector Beck, who spoke excellent English and had a voice that conveyed, beneath its careful professional neutrality, the particular controlled energy of someone sitting on top of something significant. He told Zuri that the Commission's review of the documentation she had submitted, combined with their own investigative work conducted in parallel, had produced findings of sufficient gravity to warrant a formal referral to the Prosecutor General's office. He told her that Park Seo-joon had been interviewed the previous week and had, in the presence of his own legal counsel and after what Inspector Beck described only as a productive conversation, provided a full account of the events surrounding the death of Kang Min-jae. He told her that Woo Chang-sik had been informed that morning that he was the subject of a criminal investigation and that his passport had been surrendered pending the outcome. Zuri listened to all of this standing at her office window looking out at the Gangnam morning, her hand steady on the phone, her face composed, her heartbeat doing something considerably less composed that she was not going to mention to anyone. When Inspector Beck finished, she thanked him, confirmed that she would provide any further documentation required, and ended the call. Then she sat down. She placed both hands flat on her desk. She looked at the city outside the window for a long moment. And she allowed herself, privately and completely, the full weight of what it meant that the thing she had built had held. She called Kang Jiwoo. He answered on the first ring, the way he always did now. She said, "Jiwoo." And it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both heard it and neither of them addressed it because it was simply and exactly right and required no discussion. She said, "Inspector Beck just called. Park Seo-joon has given a full account. Woo Chang-sik is under criminal investigation. His passport has been surrendered." The silence on the other end of the line was the longest silence she had ever heard from him. It was not empty. It was full of 8 months and 11 weeks and all the grief and the patience and the Thursday mornings and the 6 weeks of work and the 214 pages and the coffee and the Korean lessons and a 7-year-old girl in a serious navy dress offering a piece of rice cake across a dinner table. Full of a 19-year-old boy who had drawn buildings on napkins and whose father had taken the pencil from his hand and who had not lived to draw the ones he would have built. When he spoke, his voice was different from any voice she had heard from him before. It was not the controlled voice of the conference room or the contained voice of the Thursday meetings or even the briefly unguarded voice of the moments when something honest had broken through. It was simply a man's voice at the moment when the thing he has been carrying the longest finally, after everything, begins to release. He said, "Zuri." She said, "I know." He said, "Thank you." She said, "Your son deserved the truth on record. This is the truth on record." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to see you. Not Thursday. Today. If that is possible." She looked at her calendar. She looked at the city. She looked at her hands flat on the desk and thought about all the careful calculations and the 48-hour deadlines and the legitimate channels and the professional distance she had maintained with such deliberate precision across all the weeks of this. She thought about Naledi saying you need to go somewhere the past cannot find you. She thought about Amara saying I think he likes you mama while standing in a Seoul park in the May evening light. She said, there is a place near Bukshan Hanok village. A small tea house called Cha Mul. They have a garden in the back that is very quiet this time of day. I will meet you there at 2 o'clock. He said, I will be there. She said, Jiwoo. Come alone. He said, always. She smiled at that. She turned it away from the window so the city could not see it. But it was there. Cha Mul was everything its name promised, a small tucked-away place that Seoul kept like a secret from itself, traditional in its architecture, unhurried in its atmosphere, with a garden at the back that in late June was so green and so still that sitting in it felt like stepping briefly sideways out of the city into something older and quieter and more patient. Zuri arrived first and chose a table under an old ginkgo tree whose shade was cool and complete. She ordered 2 teas without waiting to be asked what the second person would want, because she had learned over 11 weeks of Thursday mornings that Kang Jiwoo drank his tea the same way she did, plain, hot, without ceremony. He arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. He came through the garden gate and found her under the ginkgo tree and stopped for a moment before approaching, the way a person stops when they see something they want to hold in their vision before it changes. She watched him cross the garden toward her and thought about all the rooms she had sat across from him in, the conference room, the private dining room in Itaewon, the law office at 8 in the morning, and how differently the same man could look depending on the quality of the light and the weight he was carrying in a given moment. Today he looked like a man who had set something down. Not fully. Not yet. But the beginning of it. He sat across from her. He looked at the tea she had already ordered for him. He said, you knew what I would want. She said, I have been paying attention. He said, so have I. They sat in the garden of Cha Mul for 2 hours. They talked about the case and then they talked about other things and then they talked about the things that had been sitting at the edges of all the other conversations waiting patiently for a day when the weight of the immediate crisis had lifted enough to make room for them. He told her that he had found one of Minji's sketchbooks the month before, a small one, tucked at the back of a drawer in the boy's bedroom that he had not been able to bring himself to clear. Full of buildings. Careful, detailed, beautiful buildings that a 19-year-old had drawn from pure imagination on the pages of a small notebook in the private hours of a life that had been cut short. He said he had sat on the floor of that room for a long time with the sketchbook in his hands. Zuri said nothing. She put her hand over his on the table and left it there and let the garden be quiet around them. After a moment he turned his hand over and held hers. He did not say anything. Neither did she. The ginkgo tree moved slightly in a small wind that found its way into the garden from somewhere, and the city continued its afternoon beyond the walls, and inside the quiet of that place 2 people sat with the particular stillness of those who have found, in the middle of something very hard, an unexpected and exact fit between one human being and another. He said, eventually, what happens to you when the secondment ends? She said, I go back to New York. That has always been the plan. He said, and if the plan changed? She looked at him. She said, plans are documents, Jiwoo. They are not laws. I have spent 20 years telling clients that a well-drafted plan should always contain room for amendment when new information comes to light. He said, and what would the new information be, in this case? She said, I think you know what the new information is. He looked at her steadily. He said, I want to hear you say it. She said, the new information is that I came to Seoul looking for nothing and found something I did not know I was missing. And that my daughter, who is 7 years old and has never once in her life been wrong about anything that mattered, informed me 3 weeks ago in a park while eating bingsu that the best love stories start with people working on something important together. He said, she is a remarkable child. Zuri said, she is. She also told me to stop being so professional about everything and just be a person for 5 minutes. Those were her exact words. He laughed then. A real one, full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has not laughed that way in a very long time and is slightly surprised to find that he still knows how. It was, Zuri thought, one of the finest sounds she had heard since arriving in Seoul. She filed it away in the same place she filed all the things she wanted to keep. She said, "I am not a woman who moves quickly, Jiwoo. I want you to understand that. I am careful. I think things through. I have a daughter to consider in everything I do, and she is the first consideration in every decision I make, without exception." He said, "I know that. I have known it since the Monday morning you sat across from me in that conference room and told me that my grief was not your professional concern and then spent your entire weekend building a case for me anyway because your father told you the law is only as strong as the people willing to use it." She looked at him. She said, "You remembered that." He said, "I remember everything you have said. I have been paying attention, Zuri. Since the first morning." The garden was very quiet. The ginkgo tree moved again in its small wind. Somewhere beyond the walls of Cha-mul, Seoul was fully and completely itself, enormous, indifferent, alive with the 10,000 ordinary urgencies of a city that does not pause for the private moments of the people moving through it. But inside the garden, under the old tree, time had its own quality. Unhurried. Sufficient. Exactly as much as was needed. She said, "We take it slowly." He said, "I am a patient man." She said, "Since when?" That laugh again. Briefer this time but just as real. He said, "Since a South African American lawyer told me that patience is different from frustration and then proved it by filing 214 pages that changed everything." She squeezed his hand once and then straightened and picked up her tea with both hands the way she always did, and he watched her do it with the particular quality of attention of a person who has decided that the ordinary details of another person are worth memorizing, and the afternoon light came through the ginkgo leaves and moved across the table between them in shifting patterns that neither of them tried to hold. 3 months later, on a clear September afternoon when Seoul was beginning its slow turn toward autumn and the city smelled of roasting chestnuts again the way it had when Zuri first arrived, Woo Chang-sik was formally indicted on charges of financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy in connection with the death of Kang Min-jae. Park Seo-joon, in exchange for his full cooperation, received a reduced sentence. The case was covered extensively in the Korean press and in several international outlets that picked up the cross-border regulatory angle. Zuri's name did not appear in any of the coverage, because she had structured her involvement carefully from the beginning to ensure that her role remained within the proper professional boundaries of her secondment. That was fine. She had not done it for the coverage. She had done it because her father had pressed his robe at 5 in the morning and said the truth is the only gift that costs you something real to give, and because a 7-year-old girl had looked at a photograph on a Saturday morning and said, "Mama, I know who killed that boy," and because sometimes the right thing and the inconvenient thing are exactly the same thing and you have to be willing to choose it anyway. On the evening the indictment was announced, Jiwoo came to the apartment in Yongsan-gu for dinner for the first time. He brought flowers, simple ones, white chrysanthemums, which Zuri put in the blue vase on the kitchen counter. He brought a small toy for Amara, a beautifully crafted wooden model of the Gyeongbokgung Palace that she immediately began assembling on the living room floor with focused intensity. Mrs. O, who had been told only that they were having a guest for dinner, took one look at Kang Jiwoo standing in the hallway removing his shoes and gave Zuri a look of such comprehensive and eloquent approval that Zuri had to turn away to hide her expression. Dinner was galbi that Zuri had spent the afternoon preparing, and the rice came out exactly right, and Amara sat between them at the table and conducted what was essentially an interview, asking Jiwoo what his favorite animal was, whether he preferred mountains or the sea, and whether he knew how to draw buildings because she had been working on a city of her own and could use a consultant. He answered every question with complete seriousness. When she asked about buildings he said actually yes, I knew someone who was very good at drawing buildings and I learned a little from watching him, and something moved through his face that was both grief and gratitude at the same time, the bittersweet alloy that love makes when it outlives the person who inspired it. Amara had looked at him with those eyes and said, "I think the person who taught you must have been very special," and he had said yes and looked at his hands for a moment and then looked up and found Zuri watching him across the table with an expression that said, "I see you completely and it is all right," and he had nodded once, very slightly, and the dinner had continued. After Amara was in bed, they sat on the balcony with the city below them and the Namsan Tower glowing in the September dark, and Jiwoo said, "She is extraordinary." Zuri said, "I know." He said, "She has your eyes." Zuri said, "She has her own eyes." He said, "That is what I mean." They sat on the balcony for a long time without needing to fill the quiet. Seoul moved below them in all its enormous indifferent aliveness, and the night air was cool and carried the first suggestion of autumn, and somewhere in the apartment behind them Amara slept in her room dreaming whatever 7-year-olds dream when they have spent the evening telling a man who needed it that the person who taught him must have been very special. And if you are watching this right now, wherever in the world you are, and you have ever doubted whether telling the truth is worth the cost, whether speaking up when it is complicated and inconvenient and frightening is worth what it asks of you, then let this story be your answer. Truth has no minimum age requirement. It does not wait for the convenient moment. It does not defer to power or reputation or the careful constructed surfaces that powerful people spend their lives maintaining. Sometimes truth comes in the voice of a 7-year-old girl in a serious navy dress who simply says what she saw and what she heard with the fearless clarity of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of the consequences. And sometimes, when truth is spoken into the right hands and carried by the right people through the right channels with patience and precision and the absolute refusal to let the convenient lie win, it changes everything. Not loudly. Not overnight. But completely. And permanently. And in ways that cannot be undone. Zuri Dlamini came to Seoul looking for peace. She found something that required her to be braver than peace, something that asked her to use every tool she had, every lesson her father had pressed into her alongside his mourning robe, every hour of 20 years of work, for something that mattered beyond the billable hour and the signed contract and the professional boundary carefully maintained. She found it worth every moment. Amara Dlamini came to Seoul at 7 years old and saw what she saw and said what she said with the simple uncomplicated honesty of a child who did not yet know that the world sometimes prefers its truths managed and its inconveniences buried. She changed a man's life. She helped give a father the only thing that grief without answers cannot find, the beginning of resolution. The beginning of the long, imperfect, entirely necessary work of learning to carry loss differently when you finally, after everything, know the truth of it. And Kang Jiwoo, who had built an empire and lost a son and spent 8 months carrying something that had no traction and no resolution and no end in sight, learned in the most unexpected way from the most unexpected people that power is not the same as strength, that control is not the same as peace, and that the most fortified walls in the world cannot protect you from the particular vulnerability of being genuinely, honestly known by another person, and choosing, in spite of everything you are and everything you have built, to let that be enough. Love, when it finds you in the middle of something real, does not arrive the way the stories say it does. It does not arrive in a grand gesture or a perfect moment or a declaration made in the rain. It arrives the way justice arrives, slowly, carefully, built piece by piece from the material of who you actually are, tested against real pressure, and proven not by how it begins but by what it holds when everything around it is difficult. This has been Afro Korean Love Tales. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something you needed to feel today, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story. We are here every week with tales that celebrate love, truth, courage, and the extraordinary things that happen when people from different worlds find each other in the middle of something that matters. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We read every single one and our community spans every corner of the globe. And remember, wherever you are today, truth is worth the cost. Love is worth the risk. And the right story, told at the right time, can remind you of both. We will see you in the next tale.